Yeah, as you said, this talk is going to be about virtual world generation. And coming from a games engineering background, just a short introduction to procedural world generation. Procedural content generation or world generation is a field of methods for creating large amounts of data, for example, for games, algorithmically. In comparison to traditional techniques, this has the huge benefit that costs are lower in time and thus also in financial cost. Traditional methods in this field are often composed of sub-generators. For example, you generate some leaves or some artists, acquire them from artists, and then you build an algorithmic method to generate a tree, and then you distribute these leaves on a tree, and then you distribute these trees on a terrain generated through some other method. And this compositional approach allows for very high control of generated artifacts, but also requires very much input data for each of these steps. And to remedy this, we propose a swarm-based approach in which a swarm of agent interprets a very concise database, similar to how enzymes might interpret cellular DNA or RNA. And yeah, to see if this approach is feasible, we defined a minimal viable product, which was for us generating a terrain, distributing some water or generating some bodies of water, and lastly, generating some vegetation, in our case, the trees. To do this, we built upon prior work of Sebastian, my co-author, called swarm grammars, which are, and that's a mouthful, a multi-agent based model of self-organized three-dimensional growth. Essentially, we have swarm agents of different types or species in our virtual environment, which firstly have a movement component. So they move according to very simplistic steering urges. If they see other agents of their species, they might want to go into their direction, or if too many agents are very close to them, they might move away to get some personal space, for example. Secondly, the swarm grammar model employs reproduction through replacement rules, parallel rewrite grammar. For example, saplings or agents of the sapling type or species might be replaced stochastically by trees or by tree agents, tree generating agents. And yeah, this way, for example, at the bottom, you can see a thorny twig generated through swarm grammars, because, of course, if we want to generate something, the agents have to have some kind of capability to place geometry, either directly, as Sebastian did in his prior work, through placing cuboid objects, or as you can see on the bottom, through extrusion of these cylindrical structures. And notably, the only non-movement property of these swarm agents is their energy level, which informs the size of generated structures, and also terminates the simulation when all agents reach zero energy. And to adapt this into virtual worlds, we created the virtual environment generating swarm grammar model, VSGs, firstly by abstracting or generalizing the model in terms of geometry generation. So we only or simply generate annotated point clouds, which then in turn afterwards can be interpreted in a more sophisticated way, or as you can see on the bottom, simply through these boxes. to allow agents or agent species to define dependencies in their environment and to allow agents to communicate through environmental cues, we introduced context sensitivity. For example, trees this way can define that they only can grow when there's water around. Then thirdly, to generate a virtual world, we need some kind of terrain, and therefore we implemented a terrain derivation function, which essentially generates a height map by looking through all heights of agents and weighing them differently. And agents, of course, also have to be able to sense and steer around the terrain. For example, water droplets should be able to roll down the hill slopes. And lastly, we offered some new possibilities in the energy system, how to inherit the energy level from parents in the replacement step. Well, and to see what we have done and to analyze how feasible our changes were, we conducted some parameter sensitivity analyses. For example, on the right, you can see a series of pictures in which we changed the influence of these magenta agents on the surrounding terrain. And during these experiments, we determined that we can indeed generate varying levels of detail. As you can see on the lower left, these very rocky terrain formations, as well as the broad shapes on the right. Then secondly, we looked at a tree-like model where agents moved from up from the bottom and always generated these red artifacts. And we could incorporate most parameters in this test. And in our opinion, this was rather informing or nice to look at, especially informing the use of the model later, determining viable parameter intervals and so on. And it also uncovered some issues in parameters being non-orthogonal, interacting with each other. Well, and lastly, we implemented a somewhat minimal water model in which agents rolled down slopes and accumulated in these holes or bassins. But sadly, this was not minimal enough, and the interactions were too complex to really derive some meaningful information. But happily, it just worked somehow. And therefore, we moved on, combining these minimal models, adding a lot of glue, especially glue species. For example, on the left, you can see our very first attempt where trees were generated very flatly. Because in the reproduction step, velocity was inherited from the parents to the children, and therefore the children just moved on along the ground. So we had to introduce an intermediary species with a maximum speed of 0 to remedy this. And we encountered a few such problems, which all could be remedied in model, but every glue species inflated our initial configuration. So there's some future work there ahead. Nevertheless, we wanted to see what this model allows us to do. And we built a more sophisticated world, introducing a multi-stage terrain generation. As you can see on the left, we introduced some size control through the energy level of the initial tree agent. And yeah, we combined all of this into one model you can see on the lower right, which looks, if I might say so, quite nice for a very first attempt. And yeah, I will conclude with that. In the experiments showed that the swarm-based approach does indeed have some viability and showed promising creation spaces, and therefore for us future research into the model and its capabilities is justified. And as I noted before, there is some future work ahead. For example, I'm at the moment working on evolutionary breeding of environments so that we can evolve this environmental DNA. And with that, I want to thank you. And yeah, I guess I'm open for questions if we have the time.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, any questions, comments, thoughts? Do raise your hand or something in the chat if you have questions.
Not, I'm just going back to this this animation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh. No. Can't see any hands up. Very nice. That looks so well.
Sadly, the model does not run in real time, so this had to be recorded over, I think, like 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Or 10 minutes, but it's nice to look at afterwards.
Yes, it's not an age of time. No. Yeah. Okay, so I think we're coming to the end of this session.